Hello everyone, Topsy here. Last time on Yu-Gi-Oh 101, I went ahead and set the foundation for our journey into learning how to play Yu-Gi-Oh. On that video, we broadly learned everything a new player should know before jumping into the game. For today's video, however, we're gonna go ahead and narrow in on one of those topics covered, that being the normal summon. We'll go ahead and cover all the rulings and nuances behind it, as well as all its quote-unquote variants. But with all that established, let's just jump into it. So, the normal summon. Why is it so important to understand it? Well, first off, it's an essential aspect of the game, and knowing the nuances behind these core fundamentals will result in you winning more duels, and by default, becoming a better duelist. Let us begin by first breaking down how the normal summon is conducted, and we'll work our way up from there. Alright, so the normal summon can pretty much only be conducted during a player's turn while they're still in their main phase. And on top of that, the game must also be in what's known as an open game state. In case you're unfamiliar with Yu-Gi-Oh terminology, an open game state refers to a point during a duel where no actions are taking place. So that means no effects are resolving nor activating. During this state in a game, the turn player can then play a monster directly from their hand into an available monster zone in face-up attack position. They then must declare that the monster is being normal summoned, and that's all there is to it. Now let's establish some important tidbits a player should know about this mechanic before we go on any further. First, each player is only allotted one normal summon during each of their turns. However, cards do exist that allow a player to circumvent these restrictions. These cards can exist in one of two separate groups. Let's refer to them as Group 1 and Group 2. Group 1 is composed of cards like Gemini Summon and Swap Frog, cards that grant the player one more additional normal summon, which is really cool, but it's important to realize that these cards don't stack with each other. What do I mean by they don't stack with each other? Well, what I'm trying to say here is that if you were to activate the effect of Swap Frog and the effect of Gemini Summon in the same turn, that wouldn't mean that you get two more additional normal summons. No, what that means is that if you were to activate either or, you only get one more. They don't stack with each other. The reason behind this is because the way the cards are phrased pretty much tells you that one more normal summon is being gifted to a player. And that's it. They don't fundamentally change the rules of the game. But then there's Group 2, which have cards that pretty much alter the rule on the normal summon. This is where cards like Double Summon and Chain Summoning come into play. These two cards outright state that you, the player, have a new limit to the amount of times you can normal summon during a turn. In Double Summon's case, it changes it from 1 to 2, and in Chain Summoning's case, it goes from 1 all the way up to 3. It's cases like these that I think it's incredibly important for new players to learn how to properly read card text. Allow me to elaborate a little further. Just because the cards in Group 1 aren't able to stack with each other, doesn't mean that Group 1 can't stack on top of a Group 2 card, and here's why. While Group 1 states that you can get one additional normal summon, Group 2 is outright stating that the amount of normal summons you're allowed to perform a turn has increased, meaning that these two cards can then work in tandem to allow you to perform even more normal summons. Allow me to give you an example. If you were to activate the card Double Summon and on the same turn bring out Gemini Summon, you would then, the player, be allowed to perform a whole 3 normal summons that turn, just because of the way these cards function. I do hope that explanation made sense, but if you find yourself still being confused, let me know in the comments below. That way I know whether or not I should follow up with a future video going a bit more in depth on interactions like these. But let's continue. Secondly, if a player's normal summon is impeded in any way, whether it was negated or if the monster was just removed from field, that player does not then receive another normal summon as compensation. So if you mess up your turn and didn't successfully bait out your opponent's interactions, tough luck, my friend. Better luck next turn. Third, only specific monsters can be normal summoned. Main deck monsters, with the exception of rituals, are the only monsters in the game that can be normal summoned. Furthermore, in order for a monster to be normal summonable, they must also be within the levels of 1 through 4. I'm sorry anime fans, but you won't be able to bring out your trusty Dark Magician or your almighty Blue Eyes for free like in the anime. Any monster that's higher than level 4 will require at least 1 tribute.
It's not fair!
And lastly, everything I've listed above is generally the rule, but that's the thing. It's only generally the rule, which means that there's room for tons and tons of exceptions. We'll be covering a lot of those as the video continues, but it's just something that you guys should just keep in mind. But now that we've covered the normal summon, let's move on and cover the quote-unquote variants of the normal summon. Let us begin. The 3 variants are as follows. They are the normal set, the tribute summon, and the Gemini Summon. We'll go ahead and address them in the order we listed them. So, setting. To set a monster refers to a monster being normal summoned in a face down defense position. This mechanic has fallen out of popularity for quite a while now, but was quite the staple back in older formats like GOATs. But why exactly? It was mainly the nature of the mechanic in itself. Allow me to elaborate. Setting a monster on your first turn would accomplish a couple of things. One of those things was, it would set up a small little wall to protect your life points, since if you were going first, you didn't have access to attack your opponent, but once you relinquish your turn, your opponent would then get a chance to attack you. So if you were to set a monster on your first turn, when they got their turn, they would then have to attack a defense position monster which doesn't deal damage to your own life points. But ultimately, that wasn't the only reason why monsters would be set. On top of them protecting your life points, these defense position monsters would do a bit more, and the reason why is, a lot of these monsters were either a flip monster, a recruiter, or a floater. These are all terms that a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh players use to refer to a certain category of monster. A flip monster refers to a monster that has a flip effect, so upon being flipped face up, whether it be by battle or by manually flipping it over, an effect would trigger. A floater refers to a monster that then floats into something else, hence the name, floater. And a recruiter is a monster that upon being attacked or destroyed or flipped up, would then recruit more monsters of the same name. So regardless of the type of monster that was being attacked, you could pretty much confidently ensure that some level of advantage would be accumulated from that interaction. Whether it be by gaining card advantage from drawing, searching, recovering a card from the grave, or just applying more board presence, any of these interactions would make setting a monster very powerful. Now that you've become a little more acclimated with the mechanic, let's learn about some of the nuances behind it. Number 1. You're allowed to flip summon as many times as you like during a turn. Unlike normal summoning, flipping monsters face up has no actual limit. Well, actually, let me rephrase that real quick. The amount of monsters that can be flipped face up during a turn has no limit. So if you hypothetically had 5 monsters set, you could then flip them all face up if you liked. But here's the thing, each individual monster has a 1 flip limit. Now, let's move on to number 2. And that is, not all flip monsters are treated equally. What do I mean by that? Well, there's a certain type of monster in the game that have flip effects but aren't actually considered flip monsters. During the early stages of Yu-Gi-Oh, we had a line of cards be released that became the core of a deck known as Pac-Man, which was a fairly powerful deck for players that weren't expecting the matchup, but was fairly easy to counter once you knew what you were going up against. The main gimmick of the deck was that all of these monsters had the ability to flip themselves face down, and upon being flipped face up manually would get an effect off, which in concept sounded very powerful since that meant that your flip effects could be reused, but that's where the problem lied. The way these monsters worked was that they had to be manually flipped face up, unlike flip monsters that could be flipped face up by just being attacked, which goes back to my earlier statement, not all flip monsters are treated equally. Alright, number 3 now. A monster that has been equipped by a card and/or is affected by a card effect, upon being flipped face down, loses memory of ever being equipped or affected by a card effect. What do I mean by that? Let's say hypothetically speaking, you had your Axe Raider, and you had equipped him with a spell card like Lucky Iron Axe. If that monster were to be flipped face down, that equipped spell would then be sent to the graveyard because it's no longer equipped with that face up monster. By that same logic, if you had a monster like Injection Fairy Lily on the field, and your opponent were to activate a card like Breakthrough Skill to negate its effect, if that Fairy Lily were to be flipped face down and then flipped back face up, it would then forget that its effect was ever negated, therefore regaining its effect again, pretty much treating the situation like it never happened. Alright, and lastly, high level monsters can also be set face down. But the only caveat being is that in order to be set face down, they had to be tributed first. And hey, what do you know, that's a great segue into our next mechanic. So, what exactly is a tribute summon? In short, a tribute summon is a form of the normal summon in which a duelist brings out a level 5 or higher monster from their hand by tributing at least one monster they control. Typically, monsters between levels 5 through 6 only require 1 tribute, while monsters that are level 7 and higher require 2. A lot like setting monsters, tributing has fallen out of popularity over the years. But back in its day, performing a tribute summon was huge and could drastically shift the momentum of a duel. But how come? If a player during a duel back in the old days managed to bring out a monster like Jinzo, this would pretty much allow that player to establish the pace of the duel, but that was tributing back in the day. Throughout the many years of Yu-Gi-Oh!, tribute summoning has seen quite a few changes, and monsters have been introduced that blurred the rules of the mechanic. Here's what I mean. Some monsters were introduced that outright changed the tribute requirements. For example, the Egyptian god cards, being level 10 monsters, would normally require 2 tributes to bring them out, but by their own card effect, they required 3 whole tributes in order to bring them out. Some other monsters gave you the option to tribute more in order to bring them out. Some examples were Moisture Creature and Gale for the Lightning that normally required 2 tributes, but had an effect that stated that if you were to tribute 3 monsters for them, they would get an extra special effect. Sticking with the same concept of altering the amount of tributes required, some cards would outright allow you to summon high-level monsters without tributing at all. An example of this would be a monster like Beast King Barbaros. However, this can't really be considered a tribute summon because no monsters were actually used to tribute, and instead this would be an extension of just the regular old normal summon. But sticking with that concept, there were also cards introduced like Mausoleum of the Emperor that outright just had you pay life points in order to summon tribute monsters. But again, this isn't a tribute summoning mechanic, instead it's just an extension of the normal summon. But it seemed relevant enough to bring up. But here's one of the wackier interactions with tribute summoning. Some cards would outright allow you to use spells and traps to be tributed in place of monsters. This was most commonly seen in the True Draco archetype, which this was considered a tribute summon, but via game mechanic. And lastly, the last neat interaction for tribute monsters was that some tribute monsters would allow you to tribute opponents' monsters. Some great examples of this would be cards like Monarch Stormforth, Soul Exchange, Kaijus, Raw Sphere Mode, Lava Golem, and the list continues, there's so many more. All in all, tributing as a whole has been through quite a few variations throughout the years, but fundamentally, the mechanics remained intact somewhat. Now let's wrap things up with the last variation of the normal summon, that being the Gemini Summon. The Gemini Summon was the newest type of reiteration of the normal summon. Introduced back during the GX era in the main set, Tactical Evolution, this set brought out a new type of monster known as Gemini monsters. So what's their deal? Well, Gemini monsters are unique main deck monsters that simultaneously treated themselves as normal monsters and effect monsters, depending on where exactly they were. Weird, huh? But let's stop beating around the bush and actually explain how they function. In short, a Gemini summon refers to when a Gemini monster is normal summoned twice. But before we continue any further, let's set some ground rules for Gemini monsters. First, all Gemini monsters share the following 2 effects, those being, this card is treated as a normal monster will face up on the field or in the graveyard, meaning that while in your hand, banished, or in your deck, they're still considered effect monsters. The second effect being, while this card is a normal monster on the field, you can then normal summon it to have it become an effect monster with its following effect. And of course the last effect being its actual effect. Secondly, a Gemini summon is still considered a summon, so it can be negated. So a card like Solemn Warning or Horn of the Heaven could just negate your Gemini summon, which is a real bummer. 3. Cards and effects that target a face-up Gemini monster on the field, such as equip spells, remain in effect after the Gemini summon. They don't go away. But if a Gemini monster is flipped face down and then flipped back face up, it forgets that it was ever a effect monster and goes back to being a normal monster. Now that we have this understanding, let's go ahead and go a little more in depth about the Gemini mechanic. The concept behind Gemini monsters was interesting and honestly only ever proved to be a double-edged sword for itself, since Gemini monsters had the added benefit of being able to use normal support cards, which was awesome since a lot of the support was very powerful in order to make up for the fact that vanilla monsters were inherently weak. However, Gemini monsters were excluded from using some of the better normal monster support cards that would boost their consistency, cards like Unexpected Die, Painful Choice, or Summoner Art, because they weren't treated as normal monsters where it counted the most. The fact that Gemini monsters required the player using them to use their once per turn normal summon to grant them an already summoned monster its effect was horrible. This pretty much meant that the effect of that Gemini monster had to prove to be worth summoning twice. Unfortunately, most of the time, due to their lackluster effects and old design, most Gemini monsters didn't have a worthwhile effect to justify just how much it took to bring them out. This pretty much relegated Gemini monsters to borderline unplayable levels. So why would a player ever choose to play them? Well, during some older formats, a couple of very powerful Gemini monsters saw some comparable amount of play, but it wasn't because they were Gemini monsters, instead it's because of what they were able to do as effect monsters and based on their type. The monsters that come to mind are Illblood, Gigaplant, and Neospatian Alias. But here's the thing, Illblood was a Gemini zombie monster that was able to be brought out without ever having to actually use your normal summon via cards like Mizuki or Book of Life, while Gigaplant had other ways of being cheated at as well, with cards such as Lone Fire Blossom or Miracle Fertilizer. And in Neospatian Alias's case, it was mainly used as a name because it was hyper searchable in the deck it was played in, and because of its stat lines, meaning that even in the best case scenarios, Gemini monsters were still not great because they were Geminis. They were great for other reasons. And that's all there is to Geminis. An unfortunate flub of a mechanic, but that's Yu-Gi-Oh! And with that guys, we've wrapped up the normal summon. Stay tuned for the next video where we move on and cover the special summon and everything it entails. And if you're still watching, thank you so much for the support. And please consider leaving a like and maybe subscribing for more Yu-Gi-Oh! Content. Lastly, down in the comments below, let me know if this video actually helped you understand normal summoning any better. I love to get your guys' feedback in order to grow my channel and get better at helping people. But with all that out of the way guys, I've been Topsy and have a wonderful day.